Did you know that you can time travel just by going to the beach or by hiking a mountain? Josh Murray is a geologist who studies ancient rocks from beaches and mountains to track how and why Earth's climate changed over time. Let's get started.
Hi everyone. Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Fatima. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk to you about how rocks keep Earth cool. And hopefully by the end of this, you have some idea of how that's even possible. How does a rock make Earth colder? But before I get into that, I want to talk about who I am. So my name is Josh. I grew up in the northeast of England over here in a town called Scarborough. And Scarborough is a beautiful coastal town. It's on the North Sea. And the coastline looks something like this. It's all these cliffs, and it's very close to this kind of unique environment called the North York Moors, which is this heathered, flat landscape that's a bit above sea level. And you can see in this picture, we've got some wonderful Highland cows. So it's a very rural, nice place to grow up, I would say. And neither of my parents were scientists, let alone geologists, but they would always take me outside as a kid. I spent so much time outside. We, as a family, would do things like foraging for mushrooms. We would look at fossils on the beach. And so I grew up with this real appreciation of being outdoors. And I still have that with me today. So I love to play sports. I love to take photographs. And here's this in the bottom right here. This is another photograph of Scarborough from a different angle. You can see the lighthouse and people playing on the beach. It was lovely. I spent a lot of time outside. But then I went to school and I realized what I was really interested in school, what I had a passion for was science. And I loved physics, I loved chemistry. And so when I went to university, I found geology as a way to combine my love of the outdoors with my love of science into this wonderful field of geology. And you might be wondering, what is geology? And it's really, really broad. It's one of the broader scientific fields. There are people who do all kinds of things. So there are ocean scientists, and they go on boats and they think about how the ocean works, both as a series of chemicals and also physically, how does the ocean move? There are some people who you might recognize who work in the laboratory and they understand how, or they work to understand how the chemistry and biology of Earth works. And that's a real talent in and of itself. I see myself more as a field geologist, so I like to go outside and look at rocks. And often these rocks are exposed on beaches or in mountains. And by looking at those, we can get clues about how Earth looked in the past. And some people take this all the way to the extreme, and they go into space and they become astronauts. So a lot of the early NASA astronauts were geologists, actually. But one thing that we all have in common is that we want to know how Earth works, the planet Earth. And this photo may be one of the most famous photos of Earth. This is called the blue marble because it looks a little bit like a marble. This was taken by that very geologist, that NASA geologist who has a PhD in geology. So in terms of what we study, I gave you a bit of an overview, but in terms of the people closest to me and what I do, there are kind of two camps. Some people think about how Earth moves around. And so this is an example of what an earthquake sounds like. It's this wave, so you can imagine hearing the earthquake, except it's really slowed down. And you get this pulse where the Earth is moving very quickly. Some people think about how Earth goes down to depth and then turns into volcanoes. So if you've ever seen a photo of a volcano, or if you've been lucky to see a volcano yourself, some people really are interested in how they work. And then other people think about how climate has changed on Earth through time. So you might be familiar with tree rings. So here we're looking at a tree that's been sliced, and you can see as you move from the center of the tree over to the left, you have these different layers. And those form because the tree grows quickly in the spring and slowly in the autumn. And so you get these annual cycles, and people can look at them and they can tell, okay, the tree grew a lot this year. That must have been a good year for the tree. Maybe the climate was wet. Maybe this is a thin year. The tree didn't grow very much this year. So maybe something was wrong. Maybe it was dry. Maybe it was too sunny. I don't know. But the thing about trees is they only go back maybe 1,000 years. When we think about the history of Earth, Earth's history is really, really long, and we're going to explore that a bit today. But in order to understand the climate from long ago, before trees, we have to look at things like sediments or rocks. And so these are rocks that were dug up from the ocean floor, and you can look back and see the changes in these rocks through time. And you can tell, even just by looking at it, that the color of these rocks has changed, and that's reflecting that the environment on Earth has changed. And so what I'm really interested in is how the movement of Earth's surface in things like volcanoes or maybe even earthquakes relates to Earth's climate. And I hinted at the fact that Earth history is really, really long. And I just want to take a second to appreciate how long that is. So this is a timeline of Earth from the day it formed all the way on the left here to present day all the way on the right. And if all of human history were to be placed on this line, it would be the width of a hair all the way on the right-hand side. Humans have really not existed for very long in the history of Earth. And for most of the history of Earth, it looked very, very different from today. In fact, it would be unrecognizable. However, this more recent period, the last, say, 500 million years, so not thousands, but 500 million years, things start to look a little bit more familiar. We have things like animals and some plants. And this period here, you don't need to worry about any of the names, but this period here, where we've zoomed in, that's where the dinosaurs existed. So you might be familiar with that. However, what we've learned from looking at these rocks, largely those similar to those ones I showed you where the color was changing, is that ice on Earth's surface was very rare. We actually live in an environment that is pretty unique in Earth history. For most of the history of Earth, there was no ice at all. It was warm and think tropical. And so we evolved in this kind of unique cold environment. And what I want to understand is, why did Earth go from these warm periods, tropical periods, to cold periods like today? And to do that, we have to think about a gas called carbon dioxide, or CO2, sometimes you might have heard it called. And you might be familiar with that in the modern day because we think that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is making Earth warmer and warmer. However, we think that that has naturally changed throughout history and gone from high levels of CO2 where it was warm to low levels of CO2 where it was cold. And I want to explore this one period in particular called the Ordovician. And the Ordovician is a really nice place to study because one, Earth looked very different than it did today, and two, it went from a really warm period to a really cold period, and we're going to get into that. But first, I want to show you what the Ordovician looked like. So here, you're going to see, this is a video of Earth moving around through time, and this might look familiar to you. This is how Earth currently is, okay? And so you might want to, either with your teacher or just on your own, figure out where in the world you are today. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wind the clock back, and we're going to go back 485 million years to the Ordovician period. And you will see that Earth was arranged very, very differently. These are long, long times. And so the number here, this is reflecting how many years ago it was. And when it says M, that means million, okay? So we're going to start rewinding the clock now. It's going to stay familiar for a little while, but you can see that the continents are coming together. And so around 200 million years ago, we had this big continent called Pangaea, and that existed for a while. There was some ice at the ice caps, as you can see there. And then before Pangaea, Earth's continents were split up again into all these individual sections. And so the Ordovician looks something like this. And I want to zoom in a little bit on this area here, because that's kind of the focus of what I want to talk about. And so this Earth looked a little bit like this in the Ordovician. So this is a snapshot from 465 million years ago. And you can see that Laurentia, which is this continent, don't worry about the name, this is basically North America. And so you can see this is Newfoundland. This is the island that I'm going to talk about, but there's also Nova Scotia. This is Ireland. This is Scotland. This is Greenland. And these were all in the tropics. It was really hot, and everything was rotated 90 degrees. So you can see that this is the east coast of America here that in the present day runs north-south, but at the time it ran east-west. So it's very, very different geography of the continents. On top of that, the things that were alive at the time looked totally different as well. You had these things called trilobites, which looked like bugs. They were walking around in the ocean. You had these filter feeders called graptolites. They were pulling nutrients out of the ocean. We didn't have any trees at all. So trees had not evolved yet, which is crazy. The land surface must have looked entirely different. Maybe there was some fungus growing, but that was about it. Things weren't really living on land. And then you also had sharks. We think you had the first evidence of things that look like sharks, which is, to me, it's crazy that sharks evolved before trees. But that's what the rocks tell us happened. And so Earth was a very, very different place. And for most of the Ordovician, this old period, there was no ice at the poles whatsoever. So you can think of the Ordovician as we had this strange tropical environment with weird creatures that we slightly recognize, but are a little odd to us. And then at the end of the Ordovician, it gets cold and icy. And so my job is to understand, why did it go from warm and tropical to cold and icy? And I told you that rocks would have something to do with it. And now I've got to explain why and hopefully convince you that they made a difference, okay? So we're going to talk about something called calcium. You might be familiar with calcium because it's in your bones and it's in your teeth. But it's also in the ocean, and it forms things like shells that you've seen and things like corals. And what's special about shells and corals is they mix calcium with carbon dioxide, this invisible gas, and they make their structure from those two things. And where do they get their calcium from initially? Well, all the calcium begins as rocks. And so the rocks are there, the calcium is dissolved, and the calcium goes into the ocean. And once it's in the ocean, now the shells and the corals can use it to make their calcium and CO2 mixtures that make their shells, make their corals. And so the idea for a long time has been that if you create more rocks and you get more calcium into the ocean, particularly in things like mountains, because the mountains dissolve quicker, then you can get more shells and more corals, and that removes this carbon dioxide and makes Earth colder. So the theory is mountains, calcium, and the calcium makes shells and corals, and the shells and corals make things colder, and so you get ice. Now, I've said mountains here, and what's interesting about the Ordovician is that at this time, this was a really long volcano chain, and that collided with the eastern edge of North America and Scotland and Ireland around this time. And so you were creating mountains. And so you went from a region that was probably pretty flat and easy walking to an area that was really tall and you would have to hike to get anywhere. And so that creation of the mountains has been proposed as the reason why Earth got cold. So what did I do? Well, I went with my friend and fellow geologist Zoe, and we went up to Newfoundland in Canada, and we wanted to look at the rocks that came off of these mountains. So we went and we started collecting rock samples. So here I am on another beach. The ocean is just over to the left. You can't see it here. But what we do is we take our hammer and we take our notebook and we collect these rocks. And we take a lot of notes. It's really important you take lots of notes when you're out here because you don't get to come back usually. And we looked at all sorts of rocks, but in particular, what we were curious about is what do the rocks look like in the warm period when there was no ice? And then how do the rocks change when we get to the cold period where there is ice? So we're collecting rocks through maybe 60 million years of time and trying to understand how the things have changed. And one thing we found while we were there is we found some of these fossils. You know, I told you that we had creatures like trilobites in the Ordovician, and we found those fossils. And we had things like graptolites, and we found those fossils too. So that's really good because it tells us we're in the right time period at least. And then we take those rocks, we wrap them up and we take them back to MIT. And now we started looking at them under a microscope. And so we're zoomed in really, really far here. This is about a millimeter at most along. So we're really, really zoomed in and we're looking at the minerals. And so rocks are made of minerals. We're looking at the little things that make up rocks. And And we can get a sense of how they've changed just by looking at them. But what's really helpful is to look at their chemistry. And I mentioned calcium's important, so we need to know how much calcium are in these things. So what we do is we crush the rocks up into a fine powder like flour or like sugar, really fine. And then we melt them in this furnace to create these glass beads. And these glass beads are really useful because they're one single thing that's really well mixed. And then we zap them with a laser and we dissolve them and we analyze the calcium in these rocks. And I'm just going to briefly show you the results of the calcium in these rocks to show you how it changed. So here you'll see this is how long ago it was in millions of years. And we're going from the start of the Ordovician, somewhere around here, to the end of the Ordovician here. And the dots represent each rock that we collected. And the higher up the dot is means that more calcium was taken away. And so what you see is that starting from the Ordovician, there's not much calcium that's been removed from these rocks. But then around the same time as these mountains come in, around 470, 465 million years ago, the amount of calcium increases. Maybe it doubles. So the amount of calcium going into the ocean, we think, has increased a lot. And it stays like that for another maybe 20 million years. And then it decreases back to this normal state. And this is just from looking at these rocks that began in the warm period and ended in the cold period. And we see this change. And so my finding, to cut a long story short, is that the calcium agrees with the theory and that the mountains that were made 460 million years ago made Earth colder than it would have been without the mountains. So that was a lot of details, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. And I'd be really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Josh, for walking us through your research and sharing with us how mountains can really change our climate on Earth. So to kick off our Q&A while we have questions coming in from the Nord Anglia students, I just want to ask, what is in your background, Josh? Is this a picture from the field?
Yes, this is a picture from Newfoundland itself. So these are some of the older rocks. And these are from when you might even be able to tell. You see how, hopefully I'm big enough you can see it, but you see how these rocks are really white? That's because they formed in a very tropical environment. They look like, what might be familiar, like the Bahamas or something like that. So white sand beaches, beautiful clear seas. That's the environment that we think this place in Canada was 500 million years ago. And maybe you can even tell that just from the photo itself.
Wow. And so it looks like you're on a beach there, and you mentioned that you go to beaches and mountains to look for rocks. Why is that?
So I also said that trees didn't exist in the Ordovician, but they do exist now. And so what trees do is they cover up all the rocks you want to look at. And so you're trying to find a place where rocks get exposed a lot because plants are really, really good at covering rocks up. And so a beach is nice because the waves are constantly showing you new rocks every year. They remove a little bit. They stop the plants from growing too much. And so you can walk and you can put your hand on the rocks, which is hard to do. If you've ever been to a forest, you might remember that it's actually really hard to find any fresh rocks. You might see little boulders or sand, but actually seeing a nice cliff like that is very difficult. And so think about where you have seen cliffs in your life. It's probably beaches and mountains, and that's where we want to go.
Got it. Okay, Nord Anglia students, we got to go to the beach or mountains together. Now we have a follow-up question on that note about where you decide to go to do field work from Asheria. And Asheria is wondering if you could explore any part of the world for its geological features, where would it be and why?
Oh, that's a great question, Ashia. So I've never had the chance to go to the Himalaya, and the Himalaya are really interesting because they have the tallest mountains on Earth. But the rocks that make the Himalaya are, one, they're really old. They're from the same time period that I'm studying here, and they were all formed very deep in the ocean. And so these rocks that form the highest place on Earth used to form some of the deepest places on Earth. And so these forces that are moving Earth's surface around are causing kilometers of change in terms of up and down of these rocks. So that would be really cool. We also think that, I mentioned that humans evolved in a time where there was ice. And a lot of studies recently have suggested that it was the Himalayas themselves that caused Earth to get colder. So in the same way I'm describing for the Ordovician, people think that the recent cooling, the thing that made the ice caps we can see today, that was caused by the Himalaya 50 million years ago. So that's maybe the most recent example of rocks causing Earth to be cold, and I would really like to go there and look at that.
Wow, I really hope you get to make that trip someday. That sounds absolutely amazing. Now we have a couple of questions from some really perceptive Northern Anglia students on the call, and they're wondering, Ariana from Boston's wondering if we can reduce the effects of the global warming we see today by adding more calcium-filled rocks back to the ocean. Is that possible?
That is a really great question. And so some people are actively thinking about this. There are a few plans. So I mentioned these mountains with calcium in them. They dissolve and they go into the ocean. And so people are trying to see if they can speed up that process. Some idea is to put these volcano rocks on places like farmland because the farm gets tilled every year and that helps break up the rocks. And so that might release a lot of calcium and it might make its way into the ocean. Some people also talk about putting it on beaches. So you take the volcano rock and you put it on the beach. And in doing so, you return more calcium to the ocean, like you suggest. And other people are even talking about pulling rocks behind boats. So when boats cross the ocean, they want to carry calcium-rich rocks behind them because that will help remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, in theory, all these things would work and they would help to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We do have to be a bit careful when we speed up nature like this because there's all kinds of other things that we don't fully understand. So these rocks, they produce a lot of clay. So if you have a nice clear ocean and then you add a lot of clay to it, how does that affect plants in the ocean? We don't really know. There are also other nutrients and elements that might benefit the ocean, but they might also harm the ocean. And so until we understand that properly, we have to be careful about speeding it up too much. But I think it's a really good idea, and people are really thinking about this. And that could be, if you wanted to go into this field, that could be something you worked on because there's a lot of people doing that.
That's really good to know, and it makes sense that there has to be a lot of active research before we take what we know and start using it to change the Earth system. We still have a lot of things we don't yet know. Now I have a question from Grace that's a little focused on the chemistry here. She's wondering, okay, let's say you're towing rocks behind you or putting crushed up rocks on the beaches or in the farmland, like you mentioned. Grace is wondering, how would you use this? How would you extract the rocks or make this calcium accessible without emitting more CO2 during the process?
Great question, Grace. That is always the sticking point is I have this volcano and it's not near the beach and I want to take this volcano and crush it up and put it on the beach, right? And so you're right in saying that that quarrying, the act of digging up that mountain is inherently going to release CO2. And so what people worry about is the amount of CO2 that goes into the ocean greater than the amount of CO2 that is put out in the process of collecting the volcano? And that's, of course, the biggest concern. Usually, it is CO2 negative, meaning that it will trap more CO2 than it releases. However, that's not always guaranteed, and there are examples of people trying to help, but actually end up putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. If you can do this with things like solar power or wind power, then you release less CO2 and it becomes more efficient as a way of removing CO2. And this is why we put them on the beach, is because instead of you using a big petrol engine to crush up this volcano, you can instead use the natural action of the waves to do the crushing for you, and the waves don't release CO2. So people are always trying to find ways to harness nature to do the work instead of burning fossil fuels. But you're totally right that you should be a little bit aware of how much CO2 is going in at the start before you start thinking about how much CO2 is being removed at the end. So that's a great question.
We now have some questions related to, going back in time in Earth history. You mentioned that, the Earth was warm and then it had these periods of ice and is generally warm again. Tiara is wondering, do you believe that one day the poles could be warm again? And would that mean that animals like dinosaurs would come back too? What do you think?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. It definitely seems we're heading that way right now. Earth is getting warmer and warmer, and the ice is melting. I like to believe that we will stop the warming before it gets that far. And I think it's unlikely that dinosaurs would re-evolve. Now, I'm not an expert on evolution, but I know there are some things that seem to converge through time. So for example, there are a lot of things that look like crabs for some reason. Like the crab seems to be a very efficient way to live. And so things that look like crabs keep evolving and evolving and evolving. But my understanding is that dinosaurs only existed for this one spell of maybe 200 million years. And so I imagine that if the poles melted and everything became tropical again, we would have something else evolve to fill that space, something that we can't even imagine yet. Maybe it would look a bit like a dinosaur, or maybe it would be something else entirely. I don't know.
That's a totally fair point. Life is always changing, and we're still working really hard to understand how life changed in the past. So it's pretty hard to predict in the future. We have a question from Demont as a follow-up. Demont's wondering, if rocks cool the Earth, then why does global warming exist?
Great question, Demont. So rocks do cool the Earth, and Earth, if humans stopped right now, then 100,000 years from now, Earth would return to its natural state where the ice was bigger than it is. The problem is all these natural phenomena, they act on pretty long timescales. So the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere is significantly greater, hundreds of times greater than the amount that's coming out of volcanoes. And so Earth is really good at taking volcano CO2 and reacting in the ocean to remove it. And so then it makes this natural balance. However, we're releasing CO2 far faster than nature can get rid of it. So until we stop, these rocks won't be able to do their job of making Earth cold again because they're not as fast as humans. Humans are very efficient, and the rocks are not as efficient. That's one way to think of it.
Got it. Now we have a question from Tiana who's wondering, so we have ice on Earth today. You said this is very rare in Earth's history. So we have ice on our poles, and we have glaciers and ice sheets. And Tiana's wondering, does this mean we're in an ice age right now?
That's a good question. Great question, Tiana. So we have one way of talking about ice that is ice ages and interglacials, the time between the glacials. And that happens on maybe 100,000 year timescale. So it goes, the ice sheets grow and they cover New York and they cover Boston and MIT and they cover Scotland and then they retreat. And that happens every, say, 100,000 years. It goes in and out, in and out. What I'm saying is that for most of Earth history, we didn't even have that expansion and shrinking of the ice sheets because it wasn't cold enough to even create the ice at its extreme. So we were recently in an ice age, I think around 20,000 years ago, and we were leaving the ice age before humans started warming the planet extra quickly. However, there were lots of times in Earth history where there was no ice age whatsoever. So the way we sometimes refer to that is we talk about icehouse climates. So these are climates that allow ice ages, and hothouse climates or greenhouse climates. And those are climates where there is no ice whatsoever. So it doesn't matter about the coming and going of the glaciers. I hope that made sense.
Well, I've some follow-ups related to thinking about the past and what it looked like. So we have a question from both Nanika and Ishan, and they're wondering, how do we know what Earth looked like back then? You were talking about these ice sheets on these cycles. How do we actually know? And you showed us this beautiful visual of the continents moving around. How did we figure that out?
Okay, that's a great two-part question. Let me start with how do we know the ice and the not ice? So there are some rocks that seem to only form underneath glaciers, and they look pretty unique. They're made of big chunks and small chunks. And that's because the big chunks fall on top of the ice and they melt through slowly. And the fine chunks, the little chunks, are all made because the ice is moving backwards and forwards and grinding it up into a really fine powder. So you have this mixture of powder and big rocks. And I wish I had a photo to show you, but I don't. You'll have to imagine it. Um, and so those rocks are unique to glaciers. And so when we look through the history of Earth, we only find those at very specific times. And we have other ways we can kind of guess the temperature as well based upon chemistry. But for the most part, it's about these specific glacial rocks. And so we only see them around 25% of the time when we look back in the past. And people have done a lot of looking for these things because they are a good marker of climate. So I would say that's how we know that the ice has changed. As for how did the continents move, that's a little bit more complicated. But as you might know, Earth has a magnetic field. And so when you have a compass, it points north always because it points to where the magnetic north is. And rocks are really remarkable because they record that magnetic field. So when a rock crystallizes, for example, when a volcano erupts and the rock is formed, it records something about that magnetic field. And we know from looking at these rocks that these rocks that were once formed at the equator, say, have moved 40 degrees north since then. So these rocks that I'm looking at, we can look at the magnetic field that's recorded in these rocks and show that they were once significantly further south than they are today, and also that they probably have rotated by 90 degrees. And so that's how people make those maps.
Wow, that is really cool and really, really involved. Now I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about today, what it's like being a field geologist today. And you told us that you're from Scarborough in the UK. We have folks joining us who are from Hull near Scarborough, and they're wondering, are
Oh,
you
cool.
interested in the geology in that area? Are you worried about coastal erosion there or what's happening in that environment?
Yeah, another wonderful question. And definitely from a part of the world where the coastal erosion is an issue. There are some towns just south of me that I think the first couple of houses have actually fallen in to the ocean. So it's definitely a real problem. It was happening before climate change, but I think climate change is speeding it up. There are parts of the coast that naturally erode and parts that naturally grow, but this should take longer time than it currently is taking. I must be honest, I don't think a whole lot about the geology of Northeast England. So when I go home, I love looking at it and looking at the fossils that are preserved there. Particularly for the people in Hull, I love going to Robin Hood's Bay and Whitby, if you've ever been up there, because you can go and you can find similar fossils to the ones I was showing. You can find them just in an afternoon if you're a little persistent. So I do like it more as a tourist or as a hobbyist than as a scientist, I would say. Yeah.
Totally fair. And now Rian from Boston would like to know, where in the world is your favorite place to collect rocks?
That's another really tough question. My favorite rock I've ever collected, and it's actually right here next to me, which was not planned, but it was here, is, can you, ooh, can you see this? There's this blue streak that's kind of shiny in this rock. So that's an opal. And I found this in Western Australia. So in one of my trips when I was in my undergraduate degree, we went to Western Australia and we were looking at how these limestones, similar to the ones in my background, how they were formed. And when we were just looking at these rocks, I split one of them open and inside was this beautiful opal. It's like a gemstone. And so I've always had this long-term plan of doing something with it, maybe making a little ornament or something, but I've never got around to it. But I still like having this rock on my desk near me. And so that's one of my favorites. The other place that I think is really great is California, because California has such a range of geologic environments. You have volcanoes near the coast. You have rocks made of sediment that came from these volcanoes. And then if you go east, you get into all these kind of metamorphic rocks, so rocks that have been heated and under high pressure for a long time, and they create beautiful crystals. So there's a real mix of rocks in California, and you can drive around and look at the different ones, which is nice.
That leads me to a follow-up from a student in Miss Jesperson's class, and they're wondering, do you notice or look for rocks in your everyday life? And how do you encourage other people to appreciate the things that you find really lovely about rocks?
Oh wow. The answer is yes. I do notice rocks in my everyday. In fact, I think sometimes it annoys people because we'll be walking through New York and there are like the building stones look different on every single um, building, and some of them have amazing structures or crystals in them. And it's the same in Boston, and it's the same in London, it's the same in wherever you go. In fact, the train station in my hometown, Scarborough, it has these wonderful um, structures that look like sand dunes. So you could tell that this was like, it looked like the Sahara Desert back in the day. Um, and so, yeah, I definitely wind people up because I'll be like, whoa, look at that. And initially, I think they think it's interesting, and maybe by the fourth time, they are less interested. But if you want to start doing this yourself, I encourage you to just practice observing things, and it doesn't just have to be rocks. You could go to the park and look at birds or look at what's in the lake, or if you see a rock, by all means look at it and try to imagine how it formed. Um, but I think just practicing observation of anything in the natural environment is really, really good practice. And whatever you end up studying later in life, observation would never be bad. So yeah, go outside, look at stuff. That could be mushroom. I mentioned that I looked at mushrooms a lot as a kid. So me and my sister would just walk around with our head to the ground and look at, oh, that's a cool one. That's a cool one. And that kind of thing, I think actually turned out to be really good practice for geology, even though it's a totally different subject matter.
Well, and you mentioned you use the word observation in your answer just now, and you mentioned during your talk that you have to take a lot of notes in the field because you might not necessarily get to go back to that place again anytime soon. Can you tell us what are you making notes about? What are you observing? And what is it like to be in the field in the first place?
Yeah, so uh, what are you writing down in your notes? There's a lot of things that once you take the rock and you put it in a bag and take it back to MIT, um, you're not going to necessarily, I took something like 100 rocks, I think. And so you bring these all back in a car and get a little jumbled up. They're all labeled, which is good. But then you open the bag and you look at it and you have to know what the environment was around this rock. You have to be able to contextualize it within the environment. And so we take photos. Photos are very helpful, but it's really important, we take detailed notes of the location. How close to the top of the cliff was it? What kind of appearance does it have? You can write down the color. Um, just things that will jog your memory so that you know the broad kind of environment that it was in. And then you also write down a very, very accurate location for it using a GPS. Um, yeah, and then being in the field more broadly, so it does depend where you're going. Um, but in general, you'll be camping somewhere because a lot of the best rocks are pretty far from a hotel. So you'll be camping somewhere. You wake up generally early because you want to make the most of sunlight while you have it, because once the sun sets, geology is basically impossible. So you're trying to strike while the sun is up. And then, it really depends what you're doing. Some of my field work is a lot of driving around. So you want to cover big distances. So you drive somewhere you know will be good. You drive there, you spend the day there looking at it and collecting rock samples, and then you come back. Other places, it's more of a slow, methodical hiking trip. And so you'll have a big rectangle you want to cover. You start the day at one place, and maybe you make a little bit of an indent into this rectangle you're trying to cover, and then you go home, you cook dinner, you talk, maybe you play cards. You probably don't have internet, so you have to enjoy the company of other people. Maybe you look up and see the stars. It's a really good way to kind of disconnect as well. And so I try to spend as much time in the field as I can. Um, but then you do have to come home and bring the rocks back and analyze them.
Totally fair. And after you've brought the rocks back, you've collected a bunch, you're on your way back to MIT, you've made it to the lab, you've made them into these, beautiful beads that you showed us a picture of. Lilia from Boston's wondering, what do you do with those beads after you're done studying them? Do they make good paperweights? What do you do with them?
Yeah, Lily, they are just sitting in a box somewhere in the basement of MIT in case I ever need to use them again. So I don't want to like use them too haphazardly. I don't want to contaminate them with anything. So I keep them sealed because there is a chance, and maybe it's a small chance, but there's a chance I need to analyze them another day. And so this is another part of collecting these rocks is you need to document them well enough so that you don't know 50 years from now, someone might send you an email and say, do you still have these rocks? Like, I would love to look at them. And if you've taken good notes and kept the samples in good condition, then you can say, yes, I have them. Please go ahead and study them. And what you don't want to do is just have a big box of unlabeled rocks because that's not going to be useful to anyone in the future.
That's a really great point. Now we have some amazing questions still in the Q&A, but we only have time for one more. It's a question from Nishant who's wondering, is there anyone who inspired you to become a geologist, or do you have any favorite geologists today?
Wow, great, Nishant. Yeah, so the first person who really inspired me to study geology, his name is Blair Shaney, and he is a professor at Princeton, and he studies how volcanoes contributed to making the dinosaurs go extinct. So he spends a lot of time in India, where there's these big volcanic eruptions 66 million years ago. And at that same time, that's when the dinosaurs went extinct. And so what he does is he goes out and he tries to really accurately determine the age of these volcanic eruptions. And it wasn't so much the research that inspired me, but he made science seem like a very personable thing for me in a time where science, I think, felt a little bit cold. And so he was one of the people we would go out and we would look at the stars and we would camp. We would play hacky sack in the mornings. And then we would work hard during the day, and then we would come home and chat and play cards. And so I think it was that initial relationship with geology that really got me interested. And then there are maybe too many other geologists to name that really inspire me. Yeah, they've been going for kind of 250 years at this point, and yeah, it's just there are a lot of great ones. But I would say Blair is the person who really started me on this path.
That is totally wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh, for sharing your knowledge with us and for speaking with the students today and answering all their questions about geology. I think we have future geologists here for sure. And to end, I'd also like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the students for asking such wonderful, amazing questions. I really do look forward to seeing you all out in the field someday. And I want to thank the MIT Nord Anglia Education Collaboration for making this series possible. And thank you again very much, Josh, for sharing your research with us today. See you all next time. Goodbye.
Bye.